until then, enjoy the show.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Carrie. It is such a delight to be here. I've actually never been to this campus before, which is odd because I am from another UMass campus town. I'm from Dartmouth, Mass, so I spent lots of time there. But it feels good to be coming to, not quite coming home, but as a Massachusetts born and raised person, it's nice to see our flagship here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, we'll give you a couple different stories from my own practice, but frame them in the context of why storytelling is a useful concept at all, which I believe it is, and feel free to disagree with that. In the context of urbanism, in the context of thinking about cities, thinking about how we understand cities and places and towns and settlements, and thinking about how to describe and interpret existing conditions in particular in advance of any proposed interventions, which is something I emphasize a lot because I teach historically in schools of architecture and design, where I have incredibly talented students really eager to remake and reshape the world. And I feel like one of my pedagogical goals as a teacher that's really been informed by a really wide variety, I've been very lucky to have a wide variety of professional experiences, is that before you remake the world, you gotta have some tools to be able to understand and interpret it. And so that's kind of what my work focuses on. In terms of the question of why storytelling as sort of a framework for thinking about urban practice and thinking about a human settlement and understanding it and interpreting it, I draw a lot of inspiration from this quote from the poet Muriel Rukeyser, who talks about how the universe is made of stories, right, rather than atoms. Essentially saying the ties that bind us together in kinship, in community, are as constitutive of our world and our worldviews as the physical structures, right? So as someone who works and teaches and is obsessed by the built environment, it's really important for me to always keep in mind the material dimension of narrative, right? That it actually does inform how we move through the world as much as the physical spaces that either inhibit or enhance whatever kinds of social interactions we might enjoy in place. But it is also true that stories are not just sort of a benign thing, right? The people who control the narrative control the world. So one of the reasons why I think storytelling is an important sort of critical skill that's important for designers and people who are thinking about how to intervene through physical structures or through landscapes or through policy design is to understand also how to be critical about the stories that we're receiving, right? And be critical listeners. For me, storytelling is not sort of a one-way street of somebody communicating on behalf of others, but really an exchange and an interchange. And I know you guys talk a lot about community engagement practice, and so we can talk a little bit about how this fits into that. This is not a new thing, even though we've have a lot of new tools with which to tell stories, new digital tools, new softwares, as well as the ubiquity of certain computing. We've always used visual means, those of us in the design disciplines, to understand urban phenomena, right? I always teach in all of my classes this, mid-18th century map of Rome, which is not really a map, it's a diagram, obviously, trying to actually distill what is the essential qualities of this place through reducing it to a very specific binary condition, not of public versus private, as is often understood, but through what a commoner was able to walk through or not, right? And so really trying to understand urban phenomena using visual means as a diagnostic tool becomes a way of telling a story about what are the elements of urban space that we are seeking to understand in advance of trying to intervene in them. Another famous map that also sort of hits at this and also really begins the historical story of how urbanism even evolved as a discipline, and urban planning in particular as very much being aligned with the birth of public health in a moment of extreme urbanization and growth through the industrial era of our cities, using mapping to understand, in this case, the incidences of cholera, and really using mapping to prove that it was a waterborne disease, not an airborne disease, as was thought at the time, by linking fatality rates to public infrastructure of water fountains, right? We haven't only told stories, visual stories through maps, we've also always used images, right? Again, this is not a new phenomena, right? And these have been very instrumental. A lot of the images that have explained urban experience that we've used to try and investigate and communicate about urban experience and about urban challenges as tools in support of policy reform, right? The famous images of Jacob Riis of the slums of the Lower East Side in the 1890s in New York City, where I live, were hugely influential in moving the needle on tenement reform, which actually had a huge impact on the profession of architecture because the laws that were then implemented created such a spatial complexity that you actually needed professional expertise to interpret the law in a way that before tenement reform, any builder was able to take their 25 by 100 foot lot and figure it out on their own. Images have also been really useful in things like the labor movement, right? These images by Louis Hine 20 years later in 1911 were really super instrumental in moving the needle on banning child labor, for example. So we can think about storytelling in a number of different ways. Those last two examples were both visual stories, portraits of people, environmental portraits of people in place in the context of advocacy, right? In the context of persuading people with power of the benefit of a particular strategy. But there's lots of other uses and professional applications for how storytelling can be of benefit to those of us who study the built and natural environments and seek to intervene in them. We can think about storytelling in the context of engaging community, right? Again, that sort of two-way or multi-way street of soliciting support and feedback from stakeholders. A lot of times when I talk about this in certain contexts, people assume what I mean by storytelling is totally coterminous with marketing. Marketing is one part of it, but it's by no means the full extent of it, right? Marketing is the idea of convincing a wide public of the particular importance of a certain project and the effectiveness of a particular solution. But we can also think about storytelling in something that's related to marketing in terms of public service more broadly, right? How do you raise awareness among a wide public and spark behavior change, right? An example that's present in all of our recent memories still of this would be the kinds of visual storytelling that were used to get people to, for example, socially distance during COVID, right? Actually specifically marking up territory through stickers and other kinds of tactical urbanist strategies to try and change people's behavior, right? There are other ways in which storytelling is useful in professional practice. One of the ways in which I think is actually the most interesting and has the most sort of richness related to community engagement, but community engagement we often think about in terms of trying to get buy-in after a particular strategy or a particular intervention has been decided upon. I like to think about storytelling also as having huge benefit to project development, right? Don't just go talk to the community to sell them on your chosen idea, but how do you even understand what the problem is, right? How do you identify what the problem is? To do so requires a tremendous amount of humility, of listening, of designing a process in which people feel heard. All of these are critical aspects of how and why we tell stories in the design and planning professions. I take a lot of, in my own personal projects and professional projects, take a lot of inspiration from like basic expository writing skills that some of us were lucky to learn in middle and secondary school. But really actually taking that a step further to really probe who's telling the story, who we are, what privilege we're bringing into any given situation, but also who is listening, right? Who is the audience? Not just who are they, but what is their motivation, and how can that motivation be augmented, right? Whether it's to get buy-in from stakeholders for a particular process, or whether it's to really listen and understand what it is how they articulate what is the particular challenge in their environment, right? Stories all have certain common elements, right? Good stories, characters, actions, right? Setting or context and lessons. We're pretty good about the setting in this professional world, and maybe less good about the characters, right? No matter what they look like in our renderings, right? It's a typical, critique of architectural photography, for example. Where are the people, right? But it's not just people inhabiting a space, but people actually doing things, right? There's no good story without action, and there's no action without characters executing those actions, right? And in terms of beyond elements, good stories also have certain qualities. Authenticity, right? Do you believe what's actually happening? Is it exhibiting empathy, right? That level of, again, of a two-way exchange between audience and storyteller, but also between the different characters. And clarity, right? Is it coherent? Do you understand what they're saying, right? When it comes to telling stories from the context of a designer, someone working in the built environment, there's something else that goes between, I think, the context and the solution, which is the vision, right? How will the world be different after your solution, right? So if we think about context as location or setting, and we think about solution as a design intervention, I think there's often a missing step, which is how are you actually changing the world by changing this one specific place? And in order to do that, I have learned, or I have discovered over many years of practice, we need to think about the different ways in which we collect the raw elements of our story as a specific process, right? In order to really get from context to solution via vision, I find it really helpful to think about observation, interpretation, and communication as different steps. And this is something that comes to me very much from my own background, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment. Where observation is sort of the raw data collection, if you will, right? Being out there on your site, sitting on the park bench, talking to people, those characters, really trying to understand everything and amass that using whatever kinds of record collection activities you use, whether that's your sketchbook or your iPhone or audio recordings or whatever it might be. But then there's what happens when you go back to your workspace and actually try and process that data, if you will. And that is a separate process, right, of interpretation. And both of these things need to be invested with a deep amount of empathy, clarity, authenticity, and intentionality before you even get to what we typically think of as storytelling, which is the communication part, the part that has an audience, the part where you're actually presenting something to people and hoping for a specific either behavior change or a specific kind of buy-in or understanding. And for me, what I find really helpful about trying to paint a finer picture about what I mean by interpretation is something that requires us to make the things that we think of as deeply familiar, right? The things that we take for granted about the spaces that we inhabit, and make them unfamiliar. Defamiliarize something that's pretty basic that we've come to take for granted, right? Reframe something super normal and quotidian in our lives to be able to see it anew, right? That defamiliarization is something, one of my favorite examples comes from this guy, Antanas Mockus, who was the mayor of Bogota, Colombia, some years ago, who's a really interesting character for a number of reasons. Bogota's had a legacy of lots of really interesting mayors, but this guy in particular I found super interesting in the way in which he really took this idea of defamiliarizing very, very habitual behaviors and very habitual relationships to the built environment and sought to make them unfamiliar in order to change behavior, right? He had a problem that a lot of mayors face, which was a lot of traffic, and not just a lot of traffic, but a lot of people flouting basic traffic rules, right? And this was more about just congestion. It was also, had obviously huge roots and implications in the class stratification of Colombian society, in certain people feeling they were above the law and not feeling they needed to necessarily heed traffic norms. And he basically went through this process of trying to say, okay, why do people ever do what's right or what's expected of them in any society or group? One is if they respect the law. Well, that wasn't happening. One is if they will feel bad if they don't do it. Well, that also wasn't happening. And then he realized the only thing that actually would change behavior is if people felt like they were being publicly shamed, right? And so in order to do that, he hired mimes, right? To defamiliarize this very sort of habitual set of behaviors and actually really sort of make people feel bad for being bad actors in the context of traffic congestion in Bogota, right? And he actually quotes from this Russian literary theorist in talking about the role of defamiliarization as the purpose of art, right? The purpose of art is actually to lead us to the knowledge of a thing through the organ of sight rather than of recognition, right? It's a fancy way of saying what if any of you have ever taken a life drawing class, they'll have told you, right? Draw what you see, not what you know, right? Don't actually use your assumptions and your sort of received wisdom about a place in order to try and describe it through visual means, or to try and diagnose it through mapping or through photography or through whatever your chosen medium is. Actually try and make something unfamiliar in order to see it anew. And for me, this has a deep relationship with a lot of the pedagogy and the canonical thinking about urban planning that I studied in planning school with Carrie, which was, we have all of these tools for measurement, right? We have all of these tools for quantifying everything from sun and shade to zoning densities to all kinds of things, all of which are hugely important. Don't get me wrong. But we haven't historically, as a series of related disciplines, invested in what Kevin Lynch and Gary Hack refer to as the anxiety about the spirit of place, right? Those things that can't necessarily be counted, right? That they're there, they make a place special, they give a place a certain vibe for good or ill, right? But we don't necessarily have the tools to actually really describe those essences. So I see a lot of what I teach and also what I practice as really trying to think about what some of those tools might be. What are some of those tools that might help address that anxiety and allow us to sort of make very familiar aspects of our built environment unfamiliar in advance of trying to improve them somehow through design, right? This set of tools that I personally, in terms of my own education, inherited come from documentary filmmaking, which was my first love and my first degree. And I studied film in kind of an old school program, even at the time, where video did exist, but we were using film, right? 60mm film, cutting it up with razor blades and splicing it together. And even though I still have a filmmaking practice, now it's digital. Now I just use my laptop, no more razor blades. The act of actually physically juxtaposing these distinct fragments of footage to assemble a coherent montage, I find to be very, very resonant with the practice of planning and design, right? How do you actually assemble the relevant details, make very regular, normal things about our daily life unfamiliar, not just through framing them, or reframing them, but also through juxtaposing them, right? How do you actually create a sequence of individual details in such a way that it might make you see something new in a place that you think you know, right? So for me, the concept of editing is very important, right? Not just editing in terms of censoring yourself or revising or polishing a work, but actually bringing something forth, producing something new through that act of juxtaposition, right? Montage has a very important history in sort of the history of art and literature as this technique of combining in one coherent space very dissimilar materials or very dissimilar fragments of experience, right? Which is essentially the basis of all film editing. But I think it also has metaphorically a lot to offer the practice of what we do when we go out and do site research, how we then come back and interpret it, and then how we assemble that into a coherent story that we communicate. Right. It also has a lot of interesting resonances with some of the core sort of canonical stories and conflicts in the history of American urbanism. This is obviously one of the most famous ones. I think it maybe gets a little bit too much attention, but I'm gonna keep giving more attention to it. The conflict between sort of the top-down master planning view of cities as characterized by Robert Moses, versus the observation of what's working in a legacy neighborhood as associated with Jane Jacobs, right? And I think people get Jane Jacobs wrong a lot of the time and try and think about what she was advocating in terms of a series of prescriptions. There were prescriptive elements to her writing, but I think it's actually far more interesting to think about her method than what she was describing. I don't think she was really saying everywhere in the world needs to look like Greenwich Village, right? What she was saying is, this is what I see when I look out my window every day. What do you see, right? Go out and actually look at what's working based on your own common knowledge and proceed from those particular examples, those particular fragments of experience, proceed from those towards the general. Don't start from a general idea and then try and confirm that through experimentation. It's a difference between inductive method and deductive reasoning, right? Marshall Berman actually calls this out and talks about how her writing style is an example of this kind of storytelling, the urban montage, right? Of juxtaposing distinct elements of her observations of street life, putting them together into a coherent totality. So that's some of the sort of theoretical, intellectual antecedents that have informed my own work. I've been very lucky to do lots of different things in lots of different places. These are some of the cities where I've been lucky to do work. My practice sort of falls into 4 big buckets. Teaching, which is the main squeeze right now, but it also has included a lot of multimedia video installation work, as well as research and writing, as well as narrative consultancy for professional clients, which I won't really talk about that last part in this context. But something that I do think is relevant is when talking about storytelling is we're not talking about any particular medium, right? These are lessons and skills and approaches that really can extend beyond and between different media. And one of the most important things that I have found in my practice is to not even be deterministic about what the medium is, right? Fit the medium to what you're trying to say, not the other way around. And so there have been lots of contexts where I've been working on a book project and people have said, why is that a book? Why isn't that an exhibition? Or working on an exhibition project that really wants to be a book, or working on a website that wants to be an art exhibit. There are lots of different ways in which the different projects that I've done could have been accomplished in different media, but finding out or trying to identify what is the appropriate medium for any individual project has been a big part of this approach for me. So in my teaching, as I said, I try and teach designers and planners of the future some of this strategic storytelling. And again, this really comes out of an observation, having taught in and hung out in architecture and design and planning schools for most of my adult life. This idea that all of my students, as I'm sure all of you are, incredibly sophisticated makers of images, all of which were at their best and boldest and most creative in imagining a future, right? And I really felt like my mandate as an educator was to give people more tools to describe existing conditions, which sometimes people found frustrating, right? Wait, what do you mean I can't make a 3D fly-through of this neighborhood? I'm like, no. It's also deeply creative and requires a tremendous amount of interpretive skill to only actually make images based on things that you can find and frame, not things that you can create in your mind, right? I often describe documentary filmmaking as it's like writing a book, but only using words that you put in a bucket last week, and you can't add any new words to the bucket, right? And I find that sort of problem-solving skill to actually try and make the jigsaw puzzle of the montage work to be something that's very analogous to a lot of the conditions that we find in professional practice in design and planning. So my teaching really tries to get designers to be able to make portraits using, not much more than just their phone these days, no longer have to use razor blades and tape, to create portraits of their neighborhoods, to make places that they know very well feel unfamiliar through exploring them through this idea of the urban montage. My own attempts at sort of experimenting with how montage can be a useful storytelling tool to explain what's happening in cities got its first big test a long time ago at the Venice Architecture Biennale, which was the first time that which was at the time the largest exhibition of architecture in the world, it had historically focused, as a lot of architecture exhibitions do, on kind of jewel box architecture by brand-named architects. And this was the first time in 2006 that the organizers and curators of the Biennale were really trying to focus on urban issues, right? And we're really trying to shift the attention of this sort of global elite of architects who goes to this exhibition in Venice to really try and understand some of the urban challenges that we were facing in this moment that was getting a lot of attention because of this UN statistic, somewhat specious, but this UN statistic that in 2007 would be the tipping point, after which point more than half of the world's population would be living in cities, whereas in 1900 it was apparently 10%. So this led the curators of the Biennale to really try and make portraits of very large cities around the world. They had a lot of photographs, they had a lot of statistics, they had a lot of architecture and urban scale design projects, all of which they were going to exhibit in traditional format, but they didn't really have any tools at their curatorial disposal to explain to the visitors what these places looked and felt like. So that was where I got the very lucky break to solve that problem. And so what I proposed was a series of short videos about each of these cities that they were covering, 16 cities in all. And they called me in to talk about this, and were like, okay, I think we need some video. I think we need big projection screens. Can you make some videos, or find someone to make some videos? I don't know, we just need video. And I was like, well, why do you want video? What are the aspects of video that you think are going to be helpful to your exhibition? And so what I proposed was that rather than having some, relatively ignorant person fly into places that I didn't know and try and make a movie, that I would assemble a call for unedited footage from local artists, activists, and citizens in each of these cities, and put this very wide-ranging set of footage together and mash it up through an intentional montage with archival footage of these cities over the last 100 years, and create a sort of polyvocal montage of each city. Which was a really interesting counterpoint to the kind of traditional urban metrics that were the basic stuff of the exhibition, aerial photographs, statistics like this is LA, 80% drive to work, et cetera. These very sort of somewhat misleading histograms of residential density. And so the idea was to counterpose that with an immersive video experience made by people who lived in that city to try and explain it. This is another exhibition where I made a film, this case closer to home, in New York City, about 10 years of design, not 10 years of design, 10 years of really massive rezonings in New York. And so there was this exhibit that had all this information and photographs of all of the big zoning changes in New York over this period of time. But again, there was this curatorial challenge, wait, what does it feel like in these places? And so in this case, I chose 5 neighborhoods, one in each of the boroughs of New York City, and assembled sort of a day in the life city symphony, if you will, of some of these rezoned neighborhoods. This is another exhibition. This one was at the UN, which was about, the exhibition was about design responses to extreme poverty in informal settlements, which has become something that has become a big subject of my own research practice as well, in part stemming from this work I did in 2010 and 11 in these 6 informal settlements around the world, for which I again used unedited footage from people living in specific neighborhoods that I chose for a variety of reasons, all informal settlements built by the people who lived in them, but with different sort of relationships to the formal city which they were located adjacent to. And I made this 3-screen installation that had footage from each of these cities, but then this common soundtrack that really guided viewers through the entire very poorly lit experience of the UN lobby to see all these design projects, which really ranged in scale. It was not just architectural design, it was industrial design, water filters for non-potable water, all the way up to sort of planning scale things. In Kibera, outside Nairobi, there was a hot air balloon informal mapping system that was also exhibited. So a wide range of scales and practices, and what the curators wanted from my project was to ground the visitor in the experience of place, right? That spirit of place that you can't really get without being there, but what are some ways you can approximate that, interpret what makes a particular place special, and then communicate that in an open-ended way with empathy, authenticity, and hopefully clarity. This is that same exhibition traveling around the world to South Africa and to St. Louis over here. This is another exhibition. This one was at the Cooper Hewitt, which was also in the same series. It was about the role of design in addressing questions of poverty, but this case it was in the US. And so for this one, I made a 4-screen installation of different contexts in the US, post-industrial, urban, rural, suburban, really trying to, again, expose the nature of how to ground all the design solutions that were being exhibited in the experience of place and character. Here's another more traditional documentary I did for the Habitat 3, which was in Quito, which was used as sort of a companion piece to this manifesto by some very eminent urbanists who were really trying to use this global UN conference on human settlement to advance a new agenda of openness in cities. And I reused a lot of footage that I'd used in earlier projects, as well as soliciting some new ones in order to put this one together. My own sort of writing practice has also followed similar rules of trying to juxtapose dissimilar elements and dissimilar fragments of experience to try and create something coherent. This is a book that came out in 2017, which was very much rooted in my experience of founding and editing this online journal called Urban Omnibus, which we saw as broadcasting good ideas for the future of cities worldwide, but all of which were tried and tested in New York. And what I realized after 5 or 6 years of editing this online magazine is that I really had, without really meaning to, this really interesting oral history archive of a wide range of practices of people who were, working on community gardens in one neighborhood, or working on murals in another neighborhood, or working on some sort of other aspects of making their neighborhoods more sustainable, more beautiful, more stimulating, more just, more inclusive, in ways that didn't really quite bubble up into one common coherent conversation and was not necessarily being discussed in the same ways that we talk about design by named individuals. So I really wanted to get away from, in presenting some of this work, away from a notion of only understanding the practice of making cities through the design and delivery of completed landscapes, right? This is Michael Van Valkenburg and Associates design for the Brooklyn Bridge Park. A beautiful, fantastic design. I love the park. It's super resilient and really interestingly designed. But it's only one way of thinking about making cities, right? Similar with architecture, the 34th Street Ferry Terminal. This is an important aspect of making cities, but we need to have a greater sort of grasp of how to put these kinds of design practices in greater dialogue with the people who actually build things, right? Who are also part of what I think should be considered city makers, right? I often throw my architecture students for a loop when I remind them that architects don't build buildings, right? They make systems of information with which other people make buildings, right? And so how can we actually use a coherent, a conversation that's a little bit more inclusive, that is a little bit of a bigger tent about who is actually building and making our cities, and to have a sort of broader cross dialogue among all of those different professional identities that are, some of which are professional. For these guys, it's their job, right? For some of it, it's voluntary, right? I spent a lot of time in the book writing about this space in Queens, which was essentially sort of a somewhat abandoned parking space, but it had a bunch of retail outlets alongside of it, who started doing very simple interventions to try and activate the space, stringing lights for Diwali and for Christmas, and then eventually investing in some small movable chairs, getting sort of small grants from the local Queens Museum and from the Department of Transportation for bollards and planters, and in so doing, in a very sort of low investment, right? This was also happening at the same time as the High Line. So I contrasted these two things. One, this incredibly expensive, beautiful park design project, but one that's not very replicable because of the complexity of the real estate economics in that space, with this other reuse of a vestigial piece of infrastructure that had it is much more replicable, but it's really also trying to tie the identities of these volunteers, these shop owners originally, and then the activists that came after them, to a conversation about who's actually building the city and who's designing it, right? As I said, this all comes out of this work from Urban Omnibus, which still exists. Go check it out. I haven't been there for a few years, but they're still producing some really, really interesting work. And people often ask me, why you have this sort of, well-regarded online journal. Why would you do something so stuffy as to write a book, right? Books, you can't even update books, right? Once you publish them, they're just there. But for me, a book provided a completely different opportunity to tell a different kind of story. A lot of the stories were similar to what we told on the website, but I was able to, through the format of a book, put these very real accounts of individuals and their own individual practices in their neighborhoods into dialogue with broader issues in a way that I couldn't really do on a fancy blog, right? Because of, I mean, how much time do you actually really want to spend with your eyes on a screen anyway? But also it was there was an opportunity from a book to sort of connect this to a broader reading of the intellectual history of the city, and enable me to really kind of draw lessons from these isolated practices that really related to some of the big existential threats of our time, right? Climate change, rising inequality, and a third one that I talk about in the book, which is the crisis of faith between citizens and government, and really trying to put these very specific practices into dialogue with those and develop some imperatives from that to be a little bit normative about what kind of city we want, right? How can we think about public space differently in terms of incorporating long-term use and maintenance? How can we think about infrastructure as a component of landscape? How can we use computational information technology skills not to disrupt democratic governance, but to actually make it more legible to everyday citizens? And then the last one, which has been very influential in charting the next phase of my career, which I'll end with, how to think about reconfiguring existing housing to meet shifting demographic needs. So these are all things that came from stories that we told on the website in Urban Omnibus that I then sort of reconstituted into these chapters on public space, infrastructure, information technology, and housing, and led to the work that I'm doing now, also in the sort of writing and research space, and really thinking about this last question about not just how we as designers reconfigure existing housing, but how people themselves have been taking the initiative, residents, to redefine the relationships to property, their relationships to land, and their relationships to building the structures in which they live. So I've been thinking a lot about agency recently in terms of the individual capacity of people to act, particularly in a context where that is so remote for so many of us, particularly where I live. The majority of people are renters, and the majority of renters spend more than 50% of their income on rent. So I've been exploring this in a series of articles on another great online journal, Places. The first was about community land trusts and comparing this experience in the South Bronx to one in Puerto Rico. Really trying to argue that a community land trust, which is, gets a lot of attention as an alternative to speculative ownership in the property market, is not going to necessarily scale up to meet our affordable housing challenges, but just might be a really wonderful breeding ground for the kind of political leadership we need to cultivate in some of these spaces that have been so removed from decision-making and power and the agency that has determined the majority of our urban landscapes. And then additional articles that have come out in the same series looking at some figures who've been really thinking about agency historically with respect to housing and how people can actually make decisions about their own housing. The second one is about John Abraken, who was this Dutch architect who wrote a lot of books between the 60s and as recently as 10 years ago, really about trying to figure out how design itself could center the decision-making of residents and could be able to make designs that were flexible, enable people to sort of reconfigure the interiors of their homes in ways that could respond to the shifting demographic needs of families, the different things that happen over time. All of the people that I've been looking at have a really interesting way of thinking about time, right? Which is something that I think the design disciplines are not particularly good at talking about, particularly intergenerational time, right? We expect our buildings to last generations, but with each generation, what constitutes a household or a family changes really in very fundamental ways. So he was thinking about that in a lot of interesting ways. These are some of his books. And this also enabled me to sort of play with a different kind of storytelling that I'd been kind of on the margins of because of these video installation commissions that I'd gotten in the previous few years. But to actually move into a different storytelling role and do some curatorial work, which was a lot of fun, to really think about this different kind of way of juxtaposing specific details, archival information, design schemes, in a way where, unlike a film, right, with a film you decide exactly how long everybody's going to look at every single thing, right? In an exhibit you don't have that power, and there's an incredible wonderful open-endedness to that. It also means you have to think about how you're arranging space in a completely different way. You can try and guide a little bit, okay, here's a seat, so maybe people will be more inclined to sit here and actually really read all this text. But people take completely different itineraries through these kinds of spaces. This was our first installation of the exhibition about the work of John Abraken and his work on sort of flexibility in residential environments. And then, luckily, we were able to reinstall the show at the school where I teach. This is Spitzer at City College. And make this sort of very flexible plywood system in order to really take advantage of different kinds of spaces, because it is our hope that it will continue to travel. So this was mass support, this exhibit about flexibility in resident agency and housing, and on all these walls we had the same archival information about the development of this idea of how you could systematize through a series of common dimensions an infinitely reconfigurable series of interiors. But then we juxtapose that again with projects that we put on the exterior gallery walls of different kinds of examples of flexibility in resident agency and housing, really ranging from very high-end residential Dutch design projects that had this kind of reconfigurability to them, to some prefab housing that was done in the context of post Superstorm Sandy housing reconstruction, all the way over to sort of thinking about retrofitting suburbia through zoning reform. All these different kinds of flexibility and kinds of agency juxtaposed with this historical example. All of it is part of my current research, which is really sort of thinking about the history of incrementalism, trying to tell the story of individuals who have had something to say in advancing what are their individual capacities in order to help meet their own housing needs, in a way that isn't trying to offload the responsibility of housing provision onto poor residents, but really try and include those voices in how we think about it. So this work has recently taken me to Lima, Peru, which was, for a variety of different reasons, a hotbed of experimentation in thinking about incremental housing. This was sort of a fancy vanguard competition of famous architects who were working on questions of low-rise, high-density housing in the 60s. And it was a fun sort of detective project to go and find some of these projects and actually really look at how they had been incrementally adapted by their residents over the years. It's taken me deep into the work of this guy, John Turner, who was a British architect, recently passed away, who spent the formative years, decades of his career in Lima, really looking and working very, very hand in hand with people who built their own homes to try and understand how informal housing had lessons to offer the professional design and planning disciplines in terms of really trying to recognize and respect the choices that people made about where their homes were, how big they were, and how they needed them to be able to adapt to different circumstances based on their needs of the families at different times. So this has been a really interesting research project that's taken me into a whole different kind of storytelling, drawing back to my original training as a documentary filmmaker, of actually doing ethnographic research and talking to lots of people about how they build their homes and how they make decisions about it. And it's been, again, one of the things that it really brings home is when telling stories about the built environment, it really has to begin and end with the people who are experiencing it and the people who are most affected by the decisions that they themselves make, and how that is enabled or constrained by the decisions that professionals either facilitate or help to deliver. So that's what I got. I'd love to open it up for some questions.
How did you get through all those slides so quickly? That's not a real question. Let's open it up to questions from the crowd. Here, in the back. Yeah.
So you said you're from New York City.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have thought about have seen any applications of this idea of agency and building your own home, and how it might work to maybe solve some sort of issues around homelessness.
Yeah, totally. Well, a lot of the answer to that question in terms of specific examples is I looked at when looking at the role of community land trusts in civic empowerment, which is sort of I won't go into the sort of mechanics of how it works legally, but it's essentially decoupling the ownership of the house from the ownership of the land, which is collectively owned. And traditionally, this has been something that was very useful for groups of people who were already very well organized, particularly sort of like, think about like hippie communes in rural greenfield sites creating their own community where they can create their own land tenure systems. But this model has been recently adopted by a lot of formerly unhoused people in New York. The East Harlem Community Land Trust, for example, is something where a lot of these tools about how to actually, and it's, it's complicated stuff. You need a lot of real estate legal know-how to navigate this, particularly in a dense, expensive city like New York. But the point is, if you distill these from their, very complex and intimidating legal structures to a specific series of community organizing tools, they are much more transferable. Another example that I write about historically in the incrementalism project is that of urban homesteading, which was not formerly unhoused people, but it was people who were living in multifamily buildings that had been mostly abandoned, both by their landlords and by the other residents. But there were always a few families that stayed in these abandoned buildings during periods of intense disinvestment. I'm talking about places like in the South Bronx, in Harlem at the time, this is in the 70s. And one of the stories of agency that I tell in that book is of how they actually came together to convince the city that if they rehabilitated their own homes, they should be given title to actually turn that into a cooperative building that they then owned collectively, right? So not individual condos, but a collectively owned co-op. And that took a lot of community organizing as well, but it also bred a lot of political leadership for people who were, in that case, not unhoused. They were housed, but they were very precariously housed. But because the government, in a moment of extreme bankruptcy and desperation, was willing to sort of take a bet on the agency and construction capacity of people. Now, it's not like they brought all these tools to the table already, right? There also was this very important coalition with a local nonprofit that was founded by people inspired by these same dudes that I'm writing about, John Turner and John Abraken in particular, to give them the kinds of training in both design and construction and rehabilitation, but also in the legal mechanisms to enable them to cooperatively manage a complex real estate deal like that. So there are examples of lifting up the agency of individuals, and it can't, one of the ways in which that history has been sort of poorly written is that it has been written in terms of just building, right? That the agency of poor people to solve their housing needs is to let government off the hook and just help them build their own houses. That's part of it, right? But as John Turner said, the freedom to build your own house could be, as oppressive as the freedom not to have to, right? You need to be able to actually decide what you can and can't do and where and when you can do it, right? So we're not going to be, this whole spirit of lifting up the agency of poor, insecurely housed people is not going to work if we're forcing everyone into building something they don't want to build. But what we do need to do is trust in their own decision-making capacity about the decisions that affect them the most. And so I think that's, with a lot of these older ideas, these histories that I'm working through now, a lot of them didn't achieve the desired results in a given time frame. And so we kind of threw out the whole idea. Like that's what we did with a lot of these projects to institutionalize self-building and incremental building. We kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, if you will, and I think part of the historical work that I'm trying to unearth now is to try and figure out what part was baby and what part was bathwater, because we haven't done a great job of that. Yeah?
So my question to you is, thank you first off for your presentation. Why didn't you consider looking at Dudley Street Initiative in Roxbury?
I did. I write about Dudley Street a lot in this article. I write about Dudley Street, but also I write a lot about, even more than Dudley Street, and that was the first one I ever heard of, just because I grew up around there. But the one that I spent a lot more time on, it was the first one in Georgia, and really try and trace the roots of this model to the civil rights movement and the way in which it was actually used, first in rural contexts, as ways to sort of push back again. It was from a lot of people who've been working on voting rights who really realized that figuring out how to get legal recognition for African Americans to be able to vote in a place like Georgia wasn't going to solve anything if they didn't have a secure ability to stay in the place where they lived. But then how that same model has been adapted to Dudley Street. And in fact, this example, Caño Martin Peña, there were some people from Dudley Street who were Spanish speaking who went and actually did the trainings on the legal mechanism that enabled this very, very housing insecure place along this canal to develop this model that enables them to have collective ownership of this land and not be evicted. Do you have a question? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the talk.
Uh-huh.
Really, really interesting. I'm curious about audience and impact, and maybe wondering if you could share with us some examples about when, the stories are so powerful, right?
Mhm.
But so far, I think most of what you showed is sort of like bringing it to educational content,
Mhm.
which of course has
Yeah.
impact, to museum goers, which of
Right.
course has impact. But would love to hear more about when did those stories go back?
Yeah,
Right? Or
sure.
when have you had success or felt like that worked as a strategy towards the activism?
Mhm.
Right? Because it's so hard, such a hard place to
Yeah.
navigate. I'm just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a really, really good and important question. And you're right. A lot of the stories that I've been telling in my professional practice have been in context where I'm trying to sort of raise awareness among design and policy making elites about the fact that they don't know everything, right? But also that it's not, again, I mean, the reason that it's not as simple as Robert Moses versus Jane Jacobs, right? It's not just bottom up versus top down. Those are important, important first step to understand how power works. But then you have to think about everything in between, right? Jane Jacobs was not a single crusader, right? She was an organizer, right? She organized huge amounts of people to do civil disobedience to stop the Lower Manhattan Expressway, right? Which was much more, had a different level of impact than her books, which is what we remember her for now, right? Similarly, I think in these kinds of contexts, I mean, these guys actually do a really, really good job, Caño Martin Peña, of telling their story internationally. But it's been really amazing. So like the guy from Dudley Street went to this place and to try and teach them, because they had a couple of decisions to make. They didn't necessarily need to go collective, right? They could have just been fighting for their individual title as a series of individuals. They realized they had more power together. But now some people from there have gone to Nairobi from Puerto Rico to talk to them, to be like, actually, our experience is probably more relevant to yours than our dear friends in Boston, right? Because we built our own homes and all of this. But one of the things that I found really useful about being community with some of these individuals is to help emphasize in terms of impact, the role of storytelling in organizing, right? And the role of sort of being able to tell a story about what you yourself have done and are doing, and also to help institutional capacity building around institutional memory, which a lot of activists don't have the time to really think about. Archiving, right? Keeping, actually really having a coherent narrative that you can actually, even if it's just a PDF, right? That you can then send as a brochure to someone who wants help, right? And so that's something I've really emphasized in all the work I've done with communities is, not necessarily like showing my 3-screen video installations in every single context that's appropriate for a museum and less relevant elsewhere. But the thing that ties them together is that being able to talk about what's special about your place and to be able to show it through a variety of different media can be really helpful to build the stronger kinds of coalitions that can enable this kind of political work again, I don't think this is ever going to scale up to meet our housing needs, but it can scale up to meet our political leadership needs, right, in terms of actually empowering people who have traditionally been denied access to that power. And in order to do that, they need to be activists, which they already are doing, right? But in order to be an effective activist who can create a global coalition of partners, you need to be able to share your story in a particular way. And so that's something that I find to have maybe not a huge impact, but a long tail of impact.
So we have time for one last question, as long as you can keep the response to 2 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah, my question actually kind of goes in the same direction. Like, I mean, of course, there's beautiful exhibitions, but like, who's the audience, or do they really make an impact? Where they're exhibited? Should we question this? Like, where does it hit the ground then?
Yeah.
Like, I mean,
Totally.
like Biennale. I one personal example. I had a consortium. All who work at exhibits there. I don't even had the mind to go there.
Yeah.
So it's like an exhibition that is for, like, maybe not even students, like experts.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so how does this stuff get?
Yeah. Well, this one had a very, very specific agenda, which was very specifically, the people who go to it, as you said, are the sort of global architectural elite, right? Who were used to going and seeing their friends' museums on display, right? So and then for them to go and see, a video montage of informal settlements of Istanbul or Dhaka, I don't know if that's going to change their practice about what it is they do when they go back to their, global headquarters of their global design firm. But it did sort of help to, whether it was causal or just responsive, it was part of a shift in which you started to see a lot more sort of design-based architecture firms actually trying to at least pay lip service to questions of informal housing and housing insecurity. Where that changes the policy conversation, I don't think it does, right? But it did actually have, and now you can't have another global elite show of architecture and only show museum projects without being horribly criticized, right? If you don't actually sort of respond to some of the social concerns, and this is a generational question as well, right? And I've definitely learned a tremendous amount from my students about how frustrated they are with sort of the legacies of formalism being the sort of major aspect of their education and pedagogy. But it's very different and it has to be very targeted. This was very much trying to open the eyes a little bit of a global architectural elite, whereas this one was trying to change the minds of bureaucrats at a global institution, right? This is in the lobby. They had to walk through this exhibition. This was not, they were not choosing to go there. They couldn't get to their offices if they didn't walk through this experience that was reminding them, hopefully, of, what it is we're even doing, trying to even think about international development as even a concept, which you can also problematize. But it has to be specific, right? And there is definitely these are not broadcast, mass market media stories, but you do have to know your audience in order to have any hope of even opening their eyes and changing the perspective